start, first of all, the obligatory warning to switch off your cell phones, please. The Heritage Centre in Jerusalem. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, those of you here with us in person and those watching on Zoom around the world, wherever you are, the United States, Canada, the UK and elsewhere. Those of you who are regular attendees and viewers of our programming know that much of what we've been discussing in the past 2 years or so is focused on events, at least where we've been talking about events outside Israel. We've been focusing on what's been happening on university campuses and in protests in Western capitals and elsewhere. And when you look at the history, it's one of the really central points, one of the hinge moments, if you like, when this situation that we now find ourselves in became possible and became really, I think, inevitable, was the event that we're talking about today, the passing of the UN Zionism's Racism Resolution in 1975, and the legitimizing of the idea that Zionism itself is racist, and therefore Israel is a racist endeavor, that it was born in sin, that its existence is some kind of affront to morality and human rights. And because of its singular importance, I'm particularly gratified to be able to bring this really extraordinarily qualified panel to discuss it. We couldn't have picked, me and my co-organisers, couldn't have picked a more qualified panel dealing with different aspects and different facets of the event itself and how we're living with it today. So this is the order in which we're going to hear them. First we'll hear from Isabella Tabarovsky, who's a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism. She's a fellow with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., a senior fellow with the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities in Palo Alto, and she's the author of the recently published Be a Refusnik, a Jewish Student's Survival Guide, which, by the way, we will be launching here on January 5th, so put that in your calendars. And Isabel has really been one of my most authoritative guides to Soviet anti-Zionism and that whole agenda, which of course was instrumental in creating the UN resolution that we'll be talking about today. Next we have an old friend of the Centre, Professor Gil Troy, a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill, lives in Jerusalem. He's an award-winning American presidential historian, a leading Zionist activist, the author of far too many books for me to mention. But I will, of course, mention the one most pertinent to this evening, which is Moynihan's Moment, which I think is probably the single best volume on the topic, and focused, of course, on the incisive moral clarity of the US ambassador to the United Nations at that time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Then, of course, we have Hillel Neuer, who doesn't really need an introduction, but I'll give a brief one anyway. International lawyer, writer, activist, of course, executive director of UN Watch, human rights NGO based in Geneva. I'm sure I'm not alone in watching him many times on social media and cheering from my computer screen as he takes the UN to task. He's attracted many well-deserved accolades over the years, but the one I'm going to mention in the context of this event is the one that I saw was afforded to him by Germany's Bild newspaper, which labelled him the most hated man at the UN. Definitely a compliment, I think we can agree. And last but my name is least, Professor Gerald Steinberg, founder and president of NGO Monitor, Professor Emeritus at Bar-Ilan University, and a great friend of the Begin Center. His publications include the Apartheid and Racism Campaigns, the NGO Contribution to Anti-Semitism, and Menachem Begin and the Israel-Egypt Peace Process Between Ideology and Political Realism, which we also launched here. He was recently awarded the Bernard Lewis Prize for his research on NGO anti-Semitism, He's been an indefatigable warrior against the obsessively anti-Israel culture that developed in the human rights community. Again, I think very much stemming from this Soviet-push fabrication in 1975, the libel that Zionism is racism. And I want to also mention that Joe will be back here on December 10th, which he tells me is International Human Rights Day. That wasn't in my calendar, I apologize. Where he's hosting a conversation with US Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. So you can get tickets for that event from the NGO Monitor website. 10th of December. Okay, we're now going to hear a specially recorded greeting for you from the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog. He's of course the son of Chaim Herzog, the gentleman on the left there, not only the former president, but of course Israel's UN ambassador in '75, who gave one of, I think, personally, one of the great speeches of the 20th century. And you can look that up online. After President Herzog's remarks, we will hear in turn from Isabel Tabarowski, Gil Troy, Hillel Noy, and Joel Steinberg, and then they'll have the chance to discuss with each other, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you. So, first of all, President Isaac Herzog.
Shalom, dear friends, from the President's residence. I'm so pleased and honored to address this gathering at the Begin Center, marking 50 years since one of the lowest moments in the United Nations history, the adoption of the shameful Zionism is racism resolution. I recall vividly my late father, Chaim Herzog, telling me that as he rose to the podium to respond to this libel, in his capacity as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, he felt the weight of Jewish history on his shoulders. The generations who prayed for Jerusalem, the survivors who rebuilt their lives in our homeland, and the children living in yet unborn, whose future depended on a strong and secure Jewish state. He stood and proudly declared, Zionism is nothing more and nothing less than the Jewish people's sense of origin and destination in the land. In a moment that came to symbolize more clarity, he declared that it was the United Nations itself that stood accused, and he tore the resolution to pieces. Dear friends, although Resolution 3379, that infamous resolution, was later revoked, the dangerous falsehood suggesting that Zionism is racism reverberates to this day. Especially in the wake of October 7th, we have seen how anti-Semitic libel spread swiftly from international forums to parliaments, campuses, and city streets. We watched it show up as terror against Jews and Jewish targets in Israel and elsewhere arose. Our response today, as it was in those years, is proud and principled. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, rooted in our unique and rich history as a people, and on the principles of justice, equality, and human values that we've carried throughout the ages. We insist today as then, Zionists are the finest of human beings. They were those who ran into the front lines at first call to protect others. They are those who showed up for one another in countless ways, and those who continue to show up now to build and rebuild with a deep faith in life and a spirit that will not submit. I remind us all that our fight for our hostages is not over until every last one finds dignified eternal rest. So, friends, 50 years after my father's speech at the UN, we reaffirm his message. The Jewish people will never bow to lies and libels. We will continue to build, to defend, and seek peace, and to work together with our allies to shine the light of truth through the darkness of hate. Toda rabba to all of you, and nitראה בשמחות, and may you go all from strength to strength.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. You can hear me well? Okay. So, My task on this panel is to lay out the context for the adoption of the resolution, specifically the Soviet-related context. The Soviets, of course, orchestrated the adoption of the resolution, but it didn't start in 1975. So Soviet influence in the development and penetration of contemporary anti-Zionist discourse in the West is critical, and it dates back years before the resolution was adopted. And the UN was one of several vectors in this multi-pronged propaganda and influence campaign that sought to condemn Israel and Zionism. It was part of a broader campaign to build solidarity around anti-American and anti-Western sentiments in the context of the Cold War. The Soviets had been building an anti-Western, anti-imperialist left-wing ecosystem as part of the Cold War, and Israel and Zionism were inserted into this ecosystem as one of the causes for the global left to fight against. The USSR went on an all-out war path against Israel after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, which was perceived as a threat to Soviet domestic and foreign influences. But again, it actually began to insert the language equating Zionism with racism and other ills at the UN as far back as 1965. And here we need to take a step back and talk about how the Soviets viewed the role of the UN and how they sought to gain influence within it and why. As the Cold War dawned, and particularly after Stalin died in 1953, the USSR began to work consistently to gain influence in key international and multilateral institutions. The Soviets stood behind a variety of international organizations that became front organizations, meaning that they announced one agenda or purported to have one agenda, but in reality they were serving Moscow's foreign policy agenda. So these organizations included the Helsinki-based World Peace Council, the Cairo-based Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, and there were many others. And the UN was an important target of influence as well. And to a considerable degree, this goes back to Khrushchev's era. Khrushchev came to believe that the Cold War could be won in the Third World. The Bandung Conference in 1956 laid the foundation for this, but the fundamental policy shift really can be dated to Khrushchev's visit to New York in 1960. That was really the landmark year. That year, Khrushchev spent a month at the General Assembly with the Soviet UN delegation in New York, and there he witnessed 17 new post-colonial states join the UN. 16 of them were from Africa. Christopher Andrew, a historian, and Vasily Mitrokhin, a KGB defector, wrote in their book, The World Was Going Our Way, that hearing Western imperialism publicly denounced by third world leaders in the heartland of American capitalism left an indelible impression on Khrushchev. He flew home convinced that the way to bring imperialism and the United States to their knees was by supporting the sacred anti-imperialist struggle of colonies and newly independent states. In December of that year, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, the decolonization resolution spearheaded by the USSR, calling for the rapid independence of the remaining colonies. The declaration was a milestone in decolonization, a moment that undeniably advanced the cause of freedom for newly independent nations. But for the Soviets, there was a hidden agenda in proposing it. Khrushchev, as soon as he came back from New York that year, immediately tasked Soviet propaganda staff with developing a new approach to support the agenda of building Soviet influence among these new decolonized states. In 1961, the KGB adopted a strategy to use national liberation movements and the forces of anti-imperialism in an aggressive new effort against the USSR's main adversary in the Third World. The main adversary, of course, was the United States. So from that point on, gaining influence in the post-colonial world, including among the non-aligned nations, became a Soviet priority. And this is significant because this also helps to shift. This is a time when the balance of forces at the UN shifts. By the 1970s, Afro-Asian, Latin American countries represent a majority presence within the organization. And these, again, are being aggressively courted by the USSR. You add the social bloc to this, and you have a significantly reduced presence and influence for Western countries. So, and the Soviets achieved a lot of success in this, so much so that by the 1980s, they actually believed that they're winning the Cold War based on their success in the Third World. Language and ideology played an important role in this. The Soviets largely stopped preaching ideological purity as a result of the as part of this new doctrine. Instead, they start talking about their being for peace, progress, and development. They start to position themselves as a principled opponent of imperialism, colonialism, and racism. So in other words, they align themselves with the agendas of these newly independent states for which these are real, genuinely real issues, but the Soviets are now manipulating them to gain influence. The 1950s is also when the Soviets establish a relationship with the Arab states. They become key client states and allies in this key region. And so this is kind of the landscape. As we get to 1965, this is where we are. And 65 is crucial because at that year there was a debate at the UN on the draft Convention on Racial Discrimination. The US formally proposed an article to be added stating that states parties condemn anti-Semitism. The Soviets don't want for this article to be adopted because they're afraid that it will be used against them because of state-sponsored anti-Semitism, because they are constantly accused of being anti-Semitic. And so they propose an amendment of their own, which reads, states parties condemn anti-Semitism, Zionism, Nazism, neo-Nazism, and all other forms of the policy and ideology of colonialism, national and race hatred and exclusiveness, and shall take action to combat this. Okay, so this is the first time. This is 1965, 10 years before the Zionism as Racism resolution is adopted. And this is the first time in UN annals that Zionism was formally linked to racism along with Nazism. At the time, it seemed absurd. The Americans thought it was ridiculous and almost amusing. The Soviet amendment didn't pass. The American amendment didn't pass. The Americans withdrew it to avoid a confrontation. And so, in a way, you could say the Soviets won. They achieved their goal. But this was really just the prologue. So then comes 1967, Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. And that sets off a multi-pronged global Soviet anti-Zionist campaign. They see the UN as a key vehicle for advancing these ideas, the anti-Zionist ideas, as part of their general assault on the United States and on the West. And they see the UN in general as a forum for advancing Soviet interests. So how do they achieve, how are they working to advance their influence at the UN? So one tool was the KGB. So the levels of the penetration by the KGB of the UN Secretariat are really hard to comprehend today. And by the way, it's not a secret. I'm not revealing anything new. It was reported by the American press in real time, including in the New York Times. The CIA knew about it. There were congressional hearings about it. Soviet spies were being expelled from the UN by the dozen, and yet somehow nobody could really put an end to it. So why plant so many spies, specifically in the UN? So for the KGB, the UN was a perfect watchtower on the West. And in fact, the word spies maybe is wrong here, because what they really were interested in was political warfare. So spying, it's a great place to collect political and technical intelligence. But again, it was the place to conduct influence operations, political warfare. And we can glimpse some of it from the memoirs of a Soviet high-level diplomat, Arkady Shevchenko, who worked at the UN in his highest role as an undersecretary for political affairs under Secretary General Kurt Waldheim in the 60s and 70s, and then he defected. So he describes his duties in the Secretariat, and I want to describe it because I think it really paints the picture of how it is that the Soviets worked to gain influence. So he describes his duties in the Secretariat, which is the administrative arm of the UN, right, where all of the papers circulating through the UN essentially go through, they originate from there, etc. So he describes his duties as widening the scope of Soviet ideological propaganda warfare within the organization. Part of his duty was to ensure that nothing detrimental to Soviet interests ever appeared on the UN's agenda or in its studies and reports. He was also to make sure that favorable information was included, whether it was true or not. His other duties including promoting KGB undercover agents to more influential posts and protecting them if the CIA and FBI got onto them. He was expected to indoctrinate non-Soviet staff at the Secretariat in a pro-Soviet point of view. He was also tasked with working with newly independent member states to make sure they didn't fall under the influence of Western bourgeois ideology and align themselves with Moscow and its progressive ideas. Shevchenko recalled that out of 28 staff who worked in his section of the Soviet mission in 1968, 21 were KGB or GRU officers. Other nations planted spies at the UN as well, he noted, but the Soviet Union had the largest contingent and the most thorough penetration of the organization. And the UN was such a dream base of operations for the KGB because unlike Soviet embassy staff, Soviet nationals assigned to the UN could actually move freely around the US. And because of that, expanding Soviet intelligence footprint within the organization was a constant imperative. Everyone was a target: scholars, businessmen, journalists, scientists, all kinds of experts, even Soviet diplomats' wives. The KGB installed countless agents in influential positions across the Secretariat, from the personnel office to the communications office, and Western protests failed to stop this. Long-serving Soviet ambassador to the UN, Yakov Malik, also came from an intelligence background. And Malik is known for a number of high-profile speeches at the UN in the run-up to 1975, in which he equated Zionism with fascism and Nazism. He painted Israel as the aggressor in every incident, including in the Yom Kippur War. So you can see how this language begins to be inculcated in the organization. And there's actually reason to suspect that Secretary General Kurt Waldheim himself was co-opted by Moscow because of his Nazi past, which there is good reason to believe the Soviets knew about at the time of his election. And there's been Elie Rosenbaum, who wrote a book, Betrayal, about it, notes it. So it was actually his Nazi past that made him a perfect candidate for them because they could compromise him at any moment. Once elected in 1970, Waldheim went along with a number of Soviet demands that opened the door to even more KGB spies to enter the Secretariat, and more important, Waldheim largely went along with the Soviet political agenda. So it was really under him that the race towards Zionism's racism gathered speed. So in the early 70s, in the run-up to the adoption of the resolution, a number of prominent UN forums adopt resolutions equating Zionism with imperialism, colonialism, racism, which was standard Soviet propaganda language. Yasser Arafat was invited to the UN in '74, just as Moscow was working to help internationalize the Palestinian cause. And again, if you look at his speech, he methodically, almost a dozen times, equates Zionism with imperialism and colonialism and racism. He portrays Israel as a twin of apartheid South Africa, positions it as an enemy of all post-colonial nations, and these were all standard parts of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. In the 70s, the UN really proved entirely subservient to Moscow, and all of that laid the groundwork for the adoption of Zionism as racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella, Erev Tov, or Tzoraim Tovim, depending who's watching in the US. What a thrill it is to share the stage with all these heroes. Isabella follows ideas, looking at the ugly Soviet origins, but also how they're spread today. Gerald Steinberg, I call him Tom Cruise because he follows the money. And he's shown how these human rights organizations, perfumed with all these beautiful ideas, are spreading all this ugliness right here in Israel and the United States and elsewhere. Hillel Neuer just follows them, pursuing them, putting pressure on them. And then we have Paul, who has made this space not just a place where we talk about our losses, but as the president said, a place where we also have celebrations. We celebrate our ideas, we celebrate our power, we celebrate our strength. So, Katonji, I'm really honored to be sharing the stage with all of you. You talked about the deeper origins, Isabella, of what Daniel Patrick Moynihan called the Big Red Lie. And the 50th anniversary was November 10th, 1975. But the UN, of course, always has to follow its procedures. So let's go back 3 weeks earlier to mid-October 1975. And the UN Third Committee the Human Rights Committee first has to approve the resolution. Chaim Herzog recently arrived in New York. A public intellectual, not a diplomat, not a classic diplomat, had warned his staff, Israelis, you know, can be a little jumpy. He said, not only do I think that they're going to pass this on to the General Assembly, this ugly lie, this ugly libel that Zionism is racism, but prepare yourselves. When they decide it, there's going to be a celebration. You represent the Jewish people. You represent the dignity of the Jewish people. You represent the dignity of the State of Israel. Don't show any emotion. And indeed, on that ugly Friday afternoon, the resolution passes. It will go on to become Resolution 3379 in the General Assembly, which will be passed on November 10th. And the delegates break out. They're yelling, they're screaming, some are even on tables. And the Israeli delegates are holding themselves, hands clasped, not showing any emotion, but trembling. And from across the way, the tall, 6'4" Irishman grew up on the streets of New York, went on to become a Harvard professor, and then served in the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and now Ford administration. A remarkable display of bipartisanship, which we really need, and both domestic and foreign capacities, because of his remarkable talents. Named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a liberal Democrat Catholic, stands up, straightens his tie, crosses the room, hugs Herzog, and loudly yells, "Fuck him." But the way he would tell the story, the New York Times said he simply embraced the Israeli ambassador. The way he would tell the story is he'd say, "I uttered an Anglo-Saxism not found in the Talmud." Now what's going on in October 1975? The United States is down. The Soviet Union seems to be on the right side of history. Vietnam, Watergate, inflation. New York City is going bankrupt. Ford to City, drop dead, is the famous New York Daily News headline from that time. But when New York was down, when America was down, one man stood up, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Daniel Patrick Moynihan comes to the UN, he says, I don't really have any ties to Israel. In fact, as an academic, he'd never gotten one of those fun trips to Israel. But he smelled the impact of the Zionism's racism lie. He saw it was an attempt to humiliate the United States of America, as we just heard. He saw that it was an attack on democracy and decency. And he saw that it was an attack on America's ally. And so he starts pushing, and Herzog starts pushing. And then indeed, on November 10th, 1975, and they both said, we don't care about the accused, we care about the accuser. The accuser of these totalitarian states. At the time, he called it the big red line, when we see it became the big red and green line, linking Islamism with Soviet atheism, Soviet communism, showing how you override all your fundamental ideals in pursuit of the Jew, in hatred of the Jew. And November 10th, 1975, indeed, as President Herzog said, the most famous moment in Herzog's speech was at the end when he ripped the resolution in half. But in fact, the most chilling words he said that day were at the beginning of his speech. He said, Hitler would have felt at home in these proceedings. What a condemnation of the UN. And unfortunately, a warning bell of what happened and what continues to happen. And when Daniel Patrick Moynihan got up, after the resolution passed, because people had been telling him to tone it down, he said, what does that phrase mean, toning it down? We only say it's half a lie? How do you tone down your defense of the truth, your defense of your country, your defense of the West? But because he didn't want to be the issue, he speaks after the resolution passed. And he says, the United States rises to declare that it will not abide by, will not acquiesce in this infamous act, echoing Pearl Harbor, the day that will live in infamy. And indeed, it is a day that lives in infamy. And as Paul said, it's become the Rosetta Stone, the key decoder ring of the anti-Zionist movement. And it's been renewed again and again and 1/3 of New York Jews voted for an anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist. And we're seeing the mainstreaming of the lie: Zionism, racism, settler colonialism, oppressor. So that's one theme we have to think about. The second theme, and it's so important when we speak to our students, to our next generation, not just to get stuck in the paralysis, not just to get stuck in the despair. That's why I mentioned the heroes on the stage with me tonight. But what happened? In a remarkable display of bipartisanship, Ronald Reagan, and then finally George H.W. Bush, working with Moynihan, by then was a Democratic senator, and countless Jewish organizations, and the Israeli government got the resolution repealed. And that's an important message, not to be defeated. The repeal occurred in December 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing. And so we're about, in a year, to mark the 35th anniversary. I would like to spread some homework around, because I'm a professor. I would like us to have celebrities, because now we live in this age of celebrities, and what do they call them? Influencers. Read Herzog's speech, and read Moynihan's speech, both online and in public squares, and in synagogues, and in schools. And let's study those two texts, which continue to be remarkably relevant and remarkable explorations of what Zionism truly means, and of the assault on human rights. And let's make this an educational moment, where we learn about activism, we learn about being positive, and we learn about sometimes there are great successes. And we learn what Zionism truly means, that we are a people as well as a religion. They have rights to make their homeland, and rights to establish a state on that homeland. Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. And that Zionism is the movement until 1948 to establish a Jewish state and rebuild the new Jew. And since 1948, it's the movement to defend Israel when necessary, but to build and be rebuilt, and dream always. And that's a vision of liberal democratic nationalism that we need to learn in America, we need to learn in Australia, we need to learn in South Africa, we need to learn throughout the world. And so let's truly do the jujitsu, take the negative and turn it into the positive. And make the next year a learning year, a year of activism, a year of inspiration, because we are on the right side of history. Thank you very much.
I'm honored to be on this eminent panel, and thank you, Gil, for your kind words. Your defining book on this episode, Moynihan's Moment, should be required reading for everyone, and we admire your great defense of Zionism and the Zionist idea. I want to briefly look at the legacy of Zionism is racism, which, as was mentioned, was repealed in 1991. But sadly, the institutionalized prejudice of that resolution has endured in the 5 decades since it was adopted, and you could say that it has metastasized. We can look briefly at the General Assembly, where each year there are about 15 to 20 resolutions that are adopted targeting Israel. So in the last year, for example, there was 1 resolution on Iran, 1 on Syria, 1 on North Korea, and 17 on Israel. So that's every year at the UN General Assembly. At the Zionism as Racism was repealed in 1991, but of course, 10 years later was the Durban Conference, where at the World Conference Against Racism, only 1 country was singled out, 1 situation in the governmental declaration, the Palestinians, Israel, and of course the NGO declaration had virulent language attacking Israel, so reviving the spirit of Zionism as racism. Then you have the Human Rights Council, where I'm based in Geneva, the world's highest human rights body, where at every session there is 1 agenda item on the whole world, and then there's 1 agenda item on Israel alone. So the Jewish state is singled out with its own day, its own agenda item, as no other country in the world is so singled out. At the Human Rights Council, they have the infamous position of the rapporteur on Palestinian territories, where Israel is presumed guilty in advance. The other rapporteurs examine human rights situations, the government, the rebels, all sides. This position, created in February 1993, unchanged since then, tasks the rapporteur to investigate Israel's violations. So only Israel, not Hamas, not the Jihad, not the Palestinian Authority, only Israel, and its actions in advance are presumed to be violations. And of course, you know who they appointed 3.5 years ago, someone named Francesca Albanese, who of course has become an apologist for Hamas. And then of course they have the Commission of Inquiry. They've had numerous commissions of inquiry, more commissions of inquiry against Israel than against any other country in the world. And in 2021, they created the Perpetual Commission of Inquiry. The others typically end after 6 months or a year, and this one goes on forever. And therefore we call it less a commission of inquiry. It reminds one more of the Inquisition, where there too guilt was presumed in advance. And then you have the specialized agencies. The World Health Organization is an example. They meet once a year. There too, they only have one special debate on a country situation. Most of the debates are about pandemics, world health situations, but of course there's one special debate targeting Israel, special resolutions targeting Israel. And you know the director of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, repeatedly attacked Israel, falsely accused Israel of violating the Geneva Conventions, and never mentioned that Hamas had taken over hospitals to use them as basis for terrorism. And then we have the Secretary General, who set the tone in the past 2 years, when he infamously, just weeks after October 7th, came before the UN and said, yes, I condemn the attacks of October 7th, but, he said, it is important to note that the attacks of Hamas did not take place in a vacuum. And he went on to enumerate numerous alleged Palestinian grievances, effectively legitimizing and justifying Hamas. Finally, I'll mention UNRWA, an agency with 30,000 staff whose raison d'etre is to tell Palestinians that their mission is to dismantle Israel, and spreads propaganda every single day with a budget of $1.5 billion. So this is what we're up against. The prejudice has endured, it has metastasized. And you may ask, what has changed since 1975? Maybe it's all the same. Sadly, things have gotten worse. If we look then, the UN mechanisms against Israel, there are more of them. They are more active. These commissions of inquiry, the rapporteurs, social media, it's more active, it's more intense than it was 50 years ago. And also, I would say a huge difference is when the Zionism is Racism resolution was adopted, it was seen in the West as something terrible, which was done, as we heard before, by the Soviet Union, the Arab states, much of the non-aligned or the third world were supporting this. In the West, the democracies did not vote for the resolution. Most of them, nearly all of them, voted no. And of course, in the wake of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism in the West was largely taboo. Israel, in its first 20 years in the West, was quite popular. It was a new country, especially including America. And indeed, Gil referred to Moynihan in his speech. He said the following: in all our post-war history, he said, there had not been another issue which has brought such unanimity of American opinion. And he pointed to the fact that those condemning the horrible Zionism as Racism resolution included the Congress. 436 members out of 437 condemned the infamous resolution. He pointed to the trade union movement, which were on side against the resolution. The churches he pointed to. The UN Association of America condemned the resolution and urged countries to vote against it. So that was 1975. If you fast forward to today, 50 years later, the Congress, you're not going to get 99% of the Congress supporting Israel on something like this. The unions, you're not going to get. The churches, the evangelical churches, you may get, but the mainline Protestant churches, you're not going to get on Israel's side. And the UN Association of America and other NGOs that operate in the UN, adjacent to the UN, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, which I'm sure Gerald will touch on, of course, they would not support Israel either and would not support Zionism either. And if we want to, again, compare and contrast, in 1975, the mayor at the time, his name was Abraham Bean, in October 1975, he had invited Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to a meeting. He was visiting New York, and the mayor was going to meet with him. But then he said, after I saw Sadat embrace the UN resolution of Zionism as racism, I am canceling my invitation. I'm going to hand him the key to the city. It would be hypocrisy for me to have that meeting with Sadat. He canceled his meeting. And of course, that was 50 years ago. The mayor of New York stood with Israel against the Zionism is racism resolution. And the mayor of New York today, 50 years ago, is, as we saw from his comments recently, is not standing with Israel, but is accusing synagogues of promoting violations of international law for inviting Nefesh B'Nefesh to talk about Aliyah. So, sadly, things are very different in America today, and of course in the West. As I said, in 1975, nearly all the democracies voted for Israel, the Western European democracies. Today, would the same ones vote if that resolution were brought? We have to ask ourselves, Spain and Ireland, which joined the ICJ case accusing Israel of genocide, how would they vote? 50 years ago, Ireland voted with Israel. They voted no. How would Ireland vote today? Well, we've seen what they've been saying and doing, and we saw just this weekend, if you saw on social media, we learned that in Dublin, in the capital of Ireland, the city council committee had voted, and tomorrow apparently will be the final vote. They voted to take away the name of Herzog Park. 20 years ago, in 1995, Chaim Herzog, about whom we've been hearing, who nobly fought the Zionism racism resolution in his iconic speech, he was honored in Dublin by naming the park after him, Herzog Park. And the same person who was honored, the person who fought the Zionism racism resolution, today they want to erase his name and erase his name from the park. Hopefully that will not happen. There's been a tremendous pushback. Hopefully it will not happen. But so if we look beyond the US, around the world, the situation for Israel is much worse. Why did it get so much worse? Of course, the demonization was steady over the past 5 decades. There were the UN resolutions and the NGOs, which Gerald will speak about, and they accused Israel of every possible evil. It was first occupation, then it was war crimes, then it was apartheid in 21-22. That was a major, again, that's also reviving Zionism as racism, accusing Israel of apartheid, really accusing Israel of being evil, and of course now accusing Israel of genocide. That is the situation we're facing today. How do we respond? I believe our only answer is we have to fight back, we have to stand proud, we have to tell the truth. That's what we in UN Watch are trying to do. We are at the UN, let's use it for good. We bring voices of truth. This year we brought Louai Ahmed, the Yemeni journalist, who said, I go around the world, everywhere I see the Palestinian flag, where's the Yemeni flag? 500,000 people are starving. Tens and tens of thousands have been killed. Children are starving. Where's the Yemeni flag? His 90-second speech was seen 10 million times. So we have to be a voice for truth. We have to delegitimize the delegitimizers. If Francesca Albanese is legitimizing Hamas every single day, we have to expose her lies, expose her hate. And we got her condemned by France, Germany, Canada for Holocaust conversion, for anti-Semitism, by her own country, Italy, and got the United States to sanction her in July, which is extraordinary. She cannot visit America, she cannot visit the UN, she cannot lecture anymore at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, as she was doing last year. Finally, UNRWA, largest UN agency there is, focused entirely on dismantling Israel. We expose the fact that their heads of the teachers' unions, teachers, school principals, are terror chiefs. The head of the union in Gaza was Suhail al-Hindi, terror chief of Hamas. The head of the teachers' union in Lebanon was Fatfi Sharif, who Israel eliminated last year, was the head of Hamas in Lebanon, UNRWA teacher, school principal. And thankfully, several countries have defunded. The United States, Netherlands beginning, Sweden defunded, $460 million defunded from UNRWA. We have to fight back, tell the truth, stand proud. Thank you very much.
"15 years after this infamous, notorious resolution, the Soviet Union basically disappeared. 16 years afterwards, 1 year after that, in 1991, as Gil said, Resolution 3379 was repealed. There's no Soviet Union, there's no Zionism as racism resolution, and yet, as all of you have said very eloquently, the intensity of the demonization of Israel and of Zionism has actually increased. Part of that, significant part, is through the United Nations framework, as Hill also eloquently summarized and dedicates its life to exposing, to naming and shaming, to delegitimizing. And the other half of that is through these great human rights organizations, as you mentioned a few times, highly respected, as we often see in the New York Times, the BBC, and all the way across the media, among academics, among politicians. Groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and literally hundreds more in different forms that we see. How did this happen? How did these organizations that were created and say in their mission statements that they were created in order to implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the word universal is critical, as well as the Genocide Convention that were adopted in 1948 in the shadow of the Holocaust? How did these organizations become so virulently anti-Semitic? I want to jump for a minute, to the words of the late Bob Bernstein. He was the founder of Human Rights Watch. He came back from the Soviet Union in 1978. He was at the time the publisher of Random House. And there he met with Solzhenitsyn, with Sakharov. I'm not sure if he met with with Sharansky or not. I'm not sure if he was already in the Gulag or not at the time, I don't remember. But 30 years after Bob Bernstein founded Human Rights Watch, in order to open up the gates of the Soviet Union, under the framework of the Helsinki Accords, saying we will fight, our job is to fight for the freedom of the political prisoners that are constantly being turned into victims by the Soviet machine and sent to Siberia, sent to the Gulag, in some cases dying there. We're going to force open the gates of the closed societies, Soviet bloc. That's in 1978 when he founded Human Rights Watch. In 2009, he published an op-ed in the New York Times under the heading of Rights Watchdog Lost in the Middle East, in which he said the organization that I, Bob Bernstein, founded, and you can imagine how painful this was his life's work. The organization that we founded 30 years ago has betrayed its fundamental moral principles. Instead of fighting to open up the gates of closed societies, this organization now attacks open societies. That's become its main driving force. And in addition, it is turning Israel into a pariah state. It's leading the process of turning Israel into a pariah state. This is in 2009. After the Durban Conference, after Human Rights Watch hired Middle East experts who were fundamental anti-Semites and anti-Zionists, and said it very openly. This was on the pages of the New York Times, and particularly focusing on the executive director at the time, Ken Roth. Because what had happened in this period was that these organizations had become what is called in the academic parlance the centers for post-colonialism. They took the language of all the events that Isabella talked about, and those of us who've heard her in other venues, and so much more that she has to say. And each time there are new points in this process. I had not known about Khrushchev's month-long visit in the UN. But clearly, the language, the ideology, the bias, the hate expressed as anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism was picked up as a package After the demise of the Soviet Union, through this post-colonial movement, sometimes it's called the anti-imperialist movement, the term against white supremacy, everybody's a white supremacist. Everybody else are victims of colonialism, white supremacy, and everything else, and therefore cannot be accused of violating human rights, which is why they say they justify the fact that we don't write reports about Hamas and the atrocities of October 7th. The Palestinians are victims, and you hear that throughout these organizations. And then came Edward Said, professor of English at Columbia University, who wrote a book on Orientalism, which packaged all of this. In the 1980s, it became the dominant theme in social sciences, and I use that term very hesitatingly, in other fields as well, which basically put all of this language into an academic justification called post-colonialism or Orientalism. And that is the dominant theme that you see and hear. Most students are brainwashed with this in the university courses they take. You can see it in the course listings, you can see it in the lectures and the seminars. You can see that among the texts that they use in prominent law schools, you have documents written by reports written about Israel by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International. Of course, they're also quoted in UN documents, which also become part of the syllabi. All these pieces feed on each other. These organizations became very powerful. Human Rights Watch has an annual budget of $1 million a year. You can buy a lot of propaganda and propagandists for $100 million a year. Amnesty International, last time I checked, 370 million euros, which is close to $400 million a year. Then you have groups like Medicine Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, which in the last 2 years has become a leading source of propaganda using the language of genocide, of starvation, of war crimes. It's supposed to be a medical organization that promotes humanitarian aid. They have a budget of $2.4 billion a year. And if I add to that Oxfam and so many organizations, we're going to reach a large budget, a large amount of money, $1 billion here, $1 billion here, and so we're talking about real money. That's the engine that drives a great deal of this hate. It's the engine that feeds in to the UN processes, so that when Hillel and others, occasionally myself, my colleague Ann Hertzberg more often unfortunately has to go through this, it sits through what are called debates in the UN Human Rights Council. In particular, permanent item 7 on the oppression of the Palestinians by Israelis. And NGO after NGO takes the floor, interspersed with the human rights heroes from Iran, and Syria, and Algeria, and of course from Russia and China. And repeat the same language, the same slogans, the same myths over and over again about the evil that's done by Israel. You put all of this together and you see the engine that's driving the ongoing implementation, not just ongoing, but the amplification of the hate that was embodied in this infamous resolution. It didn't die with the end of the Soviet Union. In fact, it became far more virulent, as we see on a daily basis. There's a lot more that I could say. I think we'll invite the panelists and we'll have a conversation for a few minutes on the stage. But I want to end with, what do we do about this? And I want to quote those who spoke before me. I think they articulated it very well. We are on the right side of history, Gil said, and we have to continue to say that and proclaim it loudly and not let the forces of darkness, the post-colonialists, the intersectionalityists, I don't know if that's a word, the anti-imperialists, the haters, the anti-Zionists, the anti-Semites, quiet us, keep us, silence us, as they're attempting to do. We have to delegitimize the delegitimizers, as Hillel said. I can't think of anything more important to add to that. That's in Hebrew we say the tzava sha'ah, the order of the day of the hour. And I think from what I've seen in the last 2 years, the Jewish people are doing that, standing up and defending our rights and saying no to all those who want to continue and amplify this infamous resolution. Thank you. This works okay. I think we'll switch, we'll share. I'm going to start with a somewhat provocative question of where we are now. We have an administration in Washington which, for the most part, on these issues, is in sync with this Israeli position, opposes strongly the hatred towards Israel, towards Zionism. They've adopted sanctions on Francesca Albanese, limitations or sanctions on members, officials of the International Criminal Court, and also on NGOs, recently including Al-Haq and another number of others that are actually branches of the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. How much of an opportunity, I just suggested we just go around I was going to say the table. How much of an opportunity is that? And what are the dangers of embracing this too much? I don't care who starts.
Okay.
You're next.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right, Gerald. I think there is a tremendous opportunity with this administration, which largely sees things the way we described it, and indeed has been willing to take actions. And we see with this administration, this one and the previous one, that potentially the president could do big things, whether it's recognizing Iran, Jerusalem, and so forth. So I think it is an occasion to think big. With the UN specifically, if we're speaking about the UN, there are limitations what America can do. America can veto a Security Council resolution. It was extraordinary that they were able to adopt a resolution. They were able to get China and Russia to abstain and not to veto a resolution that endorsed the Trump peace plan for Gaza. But they can cut money. UNRWA they already defunded. It was bipartisan first under Biden, and Trump perpetuated that defunding, and they are continuing to defund parts of the UN, which is largely salutary. It's forcing the UN to cut a lot of its bloat. But many things at the UN do require a majority of the General Assembly, so there are limits what America can do on its own. But it does have leverage, and some things that need allies. And so there are some things at the UN you actually want America to lead, get its allies to do things. UNRWA is an example. America defunded UNRWA, and a couple of other countries, but most countries are still on board. The UK, France, Germany, Canada, and so forth. Could America lead the others to change their approach? The only way you really stop UNRWA is getting the other countries to join in. So we have the right to think big, but there are limitations.
Before I answer that question, I just want to frame something that I think links all four of our conversations. Since October 7th, I've added a word to my definition of anti-Semitism, and it's obsession. And when I think about the disproportionate focus, which you emphasized again and again, and the obsessive hatred against the Jew we saw it in the Middle Ages, and now we see it again with Israel, the Jewish state. And that leads me to a second framing, which is what I call modern anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism reflects the triple double cross. That it's not just that you betray the Jews. That's a 3,500-year-old story, the longest hatred. It's not just that you betray liberalism, which is unfortunately a 50, 60-year-old story. But when feminists are silent after October 7th, not but those feminists who are silent, when the UN sacrifices its core ideals, it also betrays itself. So the triple double cross is betraying the Jews, betraying liberalism, and betraying yourself, and that comes from obsession. And I think that's what I heard in all the conversations today. Given that, we also talk about an obsession with one man who lives in the White House currently, and with the toxic partisan dynamics in the United States of America and in the world around Trump, I worry that everything he does, quote unquote, for us, fighting anti-Semitism on campus, pushing back against NGOs, pushing back at the UN, is going to be seen through this partisan lens. Let's forget Donald Trump for a second. When George W. Bush was president, and it became increasingly unpopular within the Jewish community after the Iraq War, the fact that he embraced Israel so wholeheartedly led to what I call the toxic embrace. With Trump, it's only gotten worse. And so I fear, look, President Joe Biden waited a year before he used the phrase Abraham Accords in any of his language, in any of his speeches, because he saw this as a Trump achievement. And that was a good thing. And that should be a democratic thing, and that should be a liberal thing, and that should be a peace thing. So when we see actually using the skills to fight, I worry that this too is going to become just another piece of the partisan puzzle, and that's bad, not just for Israel, but for the United States of America.
So, So I think I share the sentiments expressed here. I want to take it in a different direction, because I think what I think about a lot is what can each of us do, what can we do as a community, what can we as Jews do as we face this? Because, you know, what happens in the White House happens in the White House. You know, it's big picture politics. I think a lot of us feel like we have limited influence on that. What I think about is I think we all need to understand better what we face as Jewish people. I think there's a limited understanding. You know, when I look at all of the propaganda that we face, what I think about is this phrase, active measures, which is, you know, a KGB-related phrase with a special strategy that they used, special methods that they used to influence the world through media, through various groups, through propaganda, to achieve certain political outcomes. And as I look, obviously the KGB is not there, but anybody can do it. You know, what they did, anybody can do. And when I look at what happens, you know, at what the UN does, when I look at the campaign that, you know, of accusation of Israel of starving Gaza on purpose, it's like, if this were Soviet times, I would say, well, this is a classic active measure. And I think a lot of people don't see it. And so what I think is really important is for us as Jews, I think there's so much work for us to be doing internally, because if we don't do it, then we can't really effectively lobby for ourselves, we can't effectively argue on our behalf with the White House and you know, with our elected representatives. One thing I really wish is that people would understand that what's happening is not organic, that it's driven by certain forces, and this is where I come from. That the kind of, you know, taking a step back and looking at the UN and what they're doing, looking at all of the campaigns that are happening, and understanding this is somebody is producing it. Somebody is, you know, it's not just one actor, but there are different actors financing it, working together, the NGOs, etc. And I think it starts from there, sharpening our understanding of what's going on.
I fear we may have put too many issues on this table, but I'm going to put another one on, and then we'll open it up for discussion, for audience participation for a few minutes. The resolution that we're here to talk about and the damage that's been done was adopted, as Isabella told us, originally, or the language began to be circulated under the framework of the Convention and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And anti-racism was turned into anti-Zionism and then anti-Semitism. And if we go forward in each of the institutions, the United Nations, first the Commission on Human Rights and now the Human Rights Council, very thin, different, I think a distinction without a difference most appropriately, or the NGOs that I talked about. All these institutions still operate under the framework of human rights. Anti-racism in different forms, also international law, international humanitarian law has become major phrase in this framework, all basically themes and variations. And the question is, do we have a means, as a community, as a Jewish community, and as liberals, to recapture the principles on which supposedly these institutions and these frameworks were built? Can we restore the origins, the original meaning of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and recast the institutions? We have a few examples of trying to do that. Erwin Kotler in Canada has the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Bob Bernstein, I think, tried to establish a different framework before he died. It's called Human Rights First, I think.
Advancing Human Rights.
Advancing Human Rights. There's also another good human rights person. So I'm wondering whether there are means that can be used piece by piece, to re-establish the centrality, the liberality of human rights, or the liberalism at the core of human rights principles, and also the basic Jewish elements, instead of using them as weapons against the Jewish people. Maybe for this first to kill the Jew.
This goes back to Moynihan's speech, right? Moynihan warns. He says the language of human rights is being weaponized. He said the language of human rights is being diluted. By the way, we should also add that the African American community was furious at the Zionist racism resolution. Bayard Rustin, Vernon Jordan, they said if this word is hijacked and is used to mean anybody with whom we disagree, and we lose the emotional and legal power of the charge of racism, which is biologically based bigotry, which is rooted in Nazism, then we will lose something very precious to us. And he warned it. He said, and what? When we throw out these words, we won't be able to invent a new set of words. And so I fear that Moynihan was more right than wrong. And that warning from 50 years ago, and that's the reason why his colleague Leonard Garman called the resolution obscene. Because he said it was an obscenity because it's sullying these holy words. So I have to say that on the whole, I've actually seen much less progress than I would have hoped. But one ray of light. I think 5 years ago, during the George Floyd racial reckoning in the United States of America, we saw a moment where even the American Jewish community, the JFNA, the ADL, the AJC, the ABC, all the Jewish organizations were sending out anti-racism kits. They had gone fully woke. And I watched it, and I wrote, I'd never seen a community in the act of mass suicide before. And I wrote this article in the Jewish Journal, and I sent it to all my friends who run Jewish organizations. Not one of them responded because they couldn't, because they were in a kind of mental lockdown. And Commentary about a year later had a cover story saying, the end of woke is near, and it wasn't. And I said, there's no evidence. Now, even with the cloud that I was pointing out that Trump puts over it, there has been pushback. There is some movement in universities, not just from Donald Trump, but for example, the president of Harvard, Alan Garber, understands how toxic it is. There's an important article in The Atlantic in July talking about that. There's some movement in the universities, there's some movement in the human rights movement, and so I think there might be some rays of light, but the most important thing, and here I'll maybe disagree with you just a little bit, Isabella, is I want us to get out of the Jewish bubble. I think we Jews have to be working on it, but more important is we haven't done enough to really make this an American issue, a liberal issue. We're so proud of the fact that we had 290,000 Jews protesting in November 2024 on the Mall in Washington, and I was in touch with one of my students there. He said, I never felt so lonely in my life. Every single one of those Jews should have brought a date, a non-Jewish date. And Erwin Colley used to say in Montreal, find your 10 closest non-Jewish friends and bring them to the rallies. I said, Erwin, we don't have non-Jewish friends in Montreal. We'll talk about that group therapy later. But in fact, this generation of American Jews is more integrated, more assimilated, has more non-Jewish friends, and we've got to untap what I call the silenced majority and bring them to the table too.
Well, the question of can we reclaim the language? Is that of human rights? Is that what institutions, the language? I mean, it's a really, Natasha Rosky actually writes about it in the foreword to my book, where he recalls what it...
Excellent book, we should have.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So where he says, he recalls how during the Cold War, one of the really powerful things that the Campaign for Soviet Jewry did on behalf of the refuseniks was to work with the kind of deploy the understanding of human rights, and to say that what was happening to Jews in the USSR went against the principles of human rights. Can we, and he says that we need to reclaim that. We need to, change this perversion that's happened. Can we do it or not? I don't know, to be honest, because I think, language is the hardest thing to reverse when so much of it gets corrupted, and it's corrupted around human rights, it's corrupted around Zionism. When we talk about Zionism, that's kind of the biggest perversion that's happened. But I think we have to keep pointing it out. We have to keep pointing out the hypocrisy. I think the hypocrisy is really the thing that's jumping out at people the most. And perhaps that can help reverse things, or perhaps in the end it will actually, I'm afraid that the institutions of human rights have become so hollowed out that I don't even know if there is much to save. And I think that something will need to come in their place that will replace them. But yeah, it's hard to see how we simply reclaim it from where we are today.
Sure. Gil pointed to some points of light that he sees, let's say, in America. I will point to some points of light in the human rights movement. Sadly, we can speak about what's happening at the UN, which is dominated by governments. But I'll say a word about the human rights movement, which, as we've discussed, groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch veered off their original principles, as Bob Bernstein wrote in his op-ed. And these were groups that began with the most noble principles and came to a point today where they're extremely anti-Western, extremely anti-American, anti-capitalist, and virulently anti-Israel, if not anti-Semitic. And these are the largest organizations with hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're in a bad place on that. I will point to some points of light. So I was just attending 2-3 weeks ago a gathering called the World Liberty Congress, which the founders are true human rights heroes who are fighting against regimes. Masih Alinejad, the great Iranian journalist and women's rights activist who really sparked the women life freedom movement from her work going back over a decade. Masih Alinejad, Garry Kasparov, Russian world chess champion who fights the Putin regime, who's in exile in America, and Leopoldo Lopez, who's a former political prisoner of Venezuela, who was close with Maria Corina Machado, who just got the Nobel Prize. These three, whose life work is fighting some of the world's worst regimes, combined to create the World Liberty Congress, where they bring dissidents like themselves fighting dictatorships. They've had several meetings over the past few years, and now they had a very large gathering in Berlin, which was sponsored by some good groups in Berlin, including, I think, the state parliament and some foundations. And so that was a great group of people really focused on who are the world's worst abusers of human rights, who are the heroes of human rights, and helping them. So that is one group with very important people. And it's a small center of gravity compared to the hundreds of millions of dollars, but it is a point of light. There's a group called Human Rights Foundation, which every year organizes the Oslo Freedom Forum. It's similar-minded, brings similar people to give them a podium each year in Oslo. You wouldn't expect that happening in Oslo, but generally they're focused again on the world's worst dictatorships. And our own group has led since 2009. You both were in Geneva at that time. We had the first Geneva Summit. In February, we're going to have the 18th Geneva Summit for Human Rights, where similar heroes we bring as well from the world's worst dictatorships, usually about 15 dissidents who just got out of prison from China, Cuba, Zimbabwe. So there are a few of these gatherings that offer some points of light where trying to help victims and dissidents define the world's worst regimes, fighting for the true liberal principles of human rights.
I'll just add, Paul, why don't you chair the Q&A, but I'll just add also that for the first time, we're seeing whistleblowers, one at a time, coming out of these organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, Médecins Sans Frontières, even I think B'Tselem has had one, so that we've had people who said, yes, the organization which I worked in for many years is obsessed with Israel and contains a lot of people who are fundamentally anti-Semitic, It's a small movement, but I think there's some hope. It has been growing over the since October 7th, people are coming out of there, and there may be more. So this is also another point of light there.
Oh, okay, so I'm going to thank you at the end, but let's just take a few questions. We have a little bit of time. I already saw some hands very eagerly reaching for the sky. So this lady here in the front row.
Should I say like this? Or
Yeah, if you want to, do we want to? Actually, I'm going to go there.
Speak loud.
Take this. No, take this one.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to see you. I've heard a lot about you, and thank you for those insightful ideas. And especially I share this idea that we should take a step back and to see who is driving, who is the driver, who is the engine of all these tendencies. I have a question. I'm a founder of 50 Global Research Group, and we published a big media bias research in the Telegraph 1 year ago. And we discovered a great bias in the leading Western media, including BBC, CNN, New York Times, and we have made our research with the Henry Jackson Society and with Andrew Fox. I mean, we published it in his work. The question is, the research was really big, and it was it had a great reach, but the result was we haven't reached any result. And I mean that it's very difficult for volunteers, for volunteering organizations. As you say, we need to be proud, to speak out loudly. It's very difficult for organizations like us act independently because the Israeli government, Israeli state, and I'm a citizen of Israel, and it's very difficult to act without any institutional support. So you are all saying that we should push, we should move forward. What suggestion, what advice can you share with us? Maybe I'm not the only one, my colleague is here, how to promote, how to push everything, because it's really difficult. Thank you.
We'll take the questions at the end and we'll respond to them.
Okay, fine, yeah, so that's one, then left, just a second, Ben, I had a hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a colleague. So it happens occasionally. So first of all, I just want to say that I'm so thankful for you. You can hear me? No? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Just
Okay.
speak slowly.
Slowly.
Yeah.
I will try. So first of all, I just wanted to say that I'm very thankful. I have been following your work for a while, and the work of your organization, and in these dark years, I would say, not only because it was so inspirational, not only because your work has very real implications and consequences, but also because in situations when I personally think many people around the world who support Israel feel very helpless, very hopeless. It's really very inspirational, so I just want to say thank you. And the second, I have a couple of questions, one theoretical one I would say. I want to ask what you all are talking about, how situation is changing, like in Europe and in the US. I want to ask what is the role of immigration, if you see any role of immigration in this process. And the second question, we hope that soon we're going to get Abraham Accords and the relationship with our Arab neighbors, hopefully going to get better. Do you think, and these countries, as we all know, have a very different approach to Islamist propaganda, let's put it this way. Do you think the change of our relationship with these countries can affect also all what have you been talking about? Thank you.
Take one more. Take one more. This gentleman here.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me here. Basically, when I look today at what's happening in Israel and how we got surprised on the 7th of October and all of the talk with the fact that we need to try to understand where did we go wrong for the past 20, 30 years, I'm wondering whether the state of Israel, its political leadership, and the Jewish leadership all over the world is looking and asking themselves, where did we go wrong? I mean, this is 50 years ago. 35 years ago, it was abolished, and we sat back and fell asleep. We didn't think that we're going to have this particular problem coming up. We've got 750 Jewish organizations all over the world dealing with racism and Zionism, you name it, instead of concentrating and ensuring that you have the right approach. And I think it's very important to relook at where did we go wrong in the past and how can we change it going forward. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody want to go first? Go ahead.
So I'll start with immigration, because it's a very interesting question, and I'm going to be politically incorrect and say that the impact of immigration in terms of all this obsessive hatred, it brings a kind of Arab street politics to the dynamics. We see it in Canada particularly, we see it in Australia, we're starting to see it, I'm sorry to say, in parts of the United States of America, we're seeing it in England. What we're talking about is almost like high church anti-Semitism. And so, yes, there is this red-green alliance, but it's very interesting that the immigration kind of changes some of the political dynamics. Like, I think part of the reason why Trudeau in Canada and now Prime Minister Carney just aren't playing to the Jews anymore is because they're counting noses and they're seeing the impact of waves of immigration of Muslims, and there are more votes in that valley. But the intellectual infrastructure, which we as intellectuals, I think, sort of focus on, ends up being more sort of this like high church idea. Second, I think we do need a theory of change. I think, and the political scientists around the table, but I think it is important to start thinking about and looking back in history about when things have changed and when there have been inflection points and when we thought we had victories that turned out to be paper victories. And by the way, one of the things we missed because we were so busy celebrating the victory of canceling 3379 that we missed that on that same day, November 10th, 1975, there was a resolution passed creating the Committee for the Inalienable Human Rights of Palestinians, which basically bureaucratized and normalized anti-Semitism.
And funded
right? And funded it. So now you have a bureaucracy, and we were so busy fighting the idea, again, because we're so stuck in the ideas, that we missed that the infrastructure was there, and we never tried to dismantle it. And that gets to the broader issue, which connects question 1 and 3, which is conception. Everybody loves to yell and scream about Bibi Netanyahu and conception. We definitely have to talk about the conceptions and the blind spots that he had that day. But look at the blind spots of the world diplomats, who also insisted that Hamas was pragmatic and could be paid off. Look at the conception of the American Jewish establishment, which also thought that Hamas could be paid off. But more than that, had their own conception that anti-Semitism is over, we're living this golden age. And so I think we do need to challenge the establishment and challenge the state of Israel. The public diplomacy that I see coming out of Israel is negative and not helpful. Bibi Netanyahu had a skill set 30 years ago in this realm, has simply abdicated. And so we need to kind of have a real thoughtful infrastructure assessment of what's going on here, what's going on there. And I think it is, you're right, it's 850 organizations just fighting anti-Semitism. Memo, you're not getting it right. I take all that money and, like my friend Izzy Tapuchi, invested in Birthright, invested in Jewish identity building, invested in what I call Pilates, strengthen the core.
Just one comment about the Abraham Accords, immigration of the Abraham Accords. I think there's something interesting here. And it touches into what Gil was saying. In where I grew up in Canada and Australia, they're in some ways different countries. Immigration has changed the demography. It's a different country, different politics, and those of us who grew up in those countries don't really recognize them in terms of some of their policies and what's been going on in the past 2 years, how they failed to respond to virulent mobs standing outside of synagogues and other Jewish institutions. So what we see is there's a paradox, which is that the leaders of Canada, the UK and Australia seem to be either unaware or unwilling to act in face of radical Islamists who are organizing in our societies versus the Islamic countries of the Abraham Accords, let's say the Emirates or the Saudis, they know who the Muslim Brotherhood is, and they take action. They ban them, and they get it. And it seems that our leaders in major countries either don't get it or, for political reasons, are unwilling. And so you do have this paradox.
So I'll speak to the question about what we need to rethink and how we need to approach it, because when I look back at the evolution of the anti-Zionist language, we are still speaking today about new anti-Semitism. That anti-Zionism is new anti-Semitism. But in 1971, on January 3rd, there was a 5,000-word article in the New York Times that talked about anti-Zionism as new anti-Semitism. That's more than 50 years ago. They talked about all the things that we're noticing today. Wow, look at that. The far left is talking about Jews the way the neo-Nazis talk about Jews. They say Zionists, they really mean Jews. Everything that we see today was already obvious to people back then. And if you look through that history, I used to, when I started first doing my research, I thought, well, there was Soviet propaganda. A workshop on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Already then they realize what a problem it is, and they have delegates from Latin America who say, we don't say that we're Zionists in Latin America because there are so many people on the left who are against us. So I sit here and I ask, why is it that we ignored it? The signs were all there. We're sitting here 50 years later and we're saying, wow, look at this new anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. And every time, I think what happens to us is that every time there is a conflagration here in Israel, the global media goes crazy, and we somehow forget. It's like a Groundhog Day every time. We forgot what happened, and we're improvising strategies on the fly, and we're being reactive, and we can never get ahead of it. And I think the most important thing we need to do right now is promise ourselves that we're not going to forget this. We're not going to memory hole what just happened to us, the insane explosion and defamation over the last 2 years, because guess what? The other side will not have forgotten. They're going to keep learning. They're going to summarize what happened. They're going to improve their strategies, and they're going to come back. And the strategies and the tactics and the stories and the slogans don't really change. Technology changes, but it's the same war on the Jews. It continues over and over again. And I think what we really need to do is we need to sit down and say, I don't know who we are. Somebody needs to create this we, right? This is what we ask the donors. Who are all the, what are all these centers that you're funding, all the centers of anti-Semitism that you're funding, when we have scholars who have just produced something important and they don't get any support? It happens over and over again. So somebody needs to sit down, and we need to create this we that will think strategically. How do we preempt? There's research that shows that you can pre-bunk propaganda. You can, instead of debunking, you can pre-bunk when you plant ideas in advance and say this is wrong. It actually has a really incredible effect. So we need to get a lot more strategic about this.
I will quickly try to respond to the first question. And my answer is basically what I think Gil said earlier, and that is, we are on the right side of history. And you just keep saying what you have to say over and over again in any platform, in any audience that will listen. Update it, continue to do what you're doing. In GeoMonitor, the work that I've been doing for 25 years, for the first 10, 15, 20 years, we had a lot of difficulty getting traction. And that gets back to the issue of lack of strategy, lack of leadership. What we had was a lot of tactics. Short-term, large budget, a lot of splashes, a lot of headlines, a lot of conferences, and zero coherent strategy. I don't know who's going to put that together, but I think collectively we are helping to compose that because we have no choice. Since October 7th, this has been talked about as the 8th front. There's no ceasefire, much of the ceasefire on some of the other fronts, but there's no ceasefire here at all. This is what we have to learn from the past 2 years. We absolutely need to have a long-term strategy and not this ad hoc, tactical, political approach. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I want to thank Joe Steinberg, John Noy, and Glassman, for an amazing panel for a fantastic me, Gil, in the Jerusalem Post, the Jewish Journal, lots of other places, Isabella on Tablet Magazine and other places. Check out NGO Monitor's website and their amazing research and reports. Hillel Neuer, follow him on social media. It will give you a very good feeling, I promise. And check out the UN Watch website. Of course, come back here 10th of December for Gerald in conversation with Ambassador Mike Huckabee. You can get tickets on the NGO Monitor website. And 5th of January, Isabella will be here to talk about her new book. So please come to that as well. Great to see you all. Hope to see you again. Good night.